Hello there, and welcome to a future-focused history video. I'm Mike Maxwell. Have you ever wondered what is the most important history for us to know? Seems like a pretty basic question, but I never gave it any thought until I became a history teacher around midlife and figured it was my job to teach whatever it is to students. Like most people, probably, I assumed it was the greatest hits of history we've all heard about, like the Roman Empire or the American Civil War. At the beginning of my student-teacher experience, I asked my veteran mentor teacher what I should teach. He didn't say a word. He just reached over and handed me a big old history textbook like this one, like it was the History Bible or something. It contained the greatest hits of history, all right, plus lots of obscure stuff I'd never heard of, even though I had a college degree in history. I quickly learned that textbooks are terrible teaching tools. There's no way to cover all the stuff in here in any kind of meaningful way with students. And what would be the point anyway? 5 pounds and 12 ounces. How would you like to carry this around in your backpack all day? So, when I got my own classroom, I began to write my own concise world history. What was the point? The point was to provide my students with an understandable overview of human development through time, a big picture of history that could be comprehended by the normal human brain. 7 ounces. I thought this was the most important history I could teach. But when I retired from the classroom, I gave myself a new job, to find out how history education could be made more useful. And from this perspective of usefulness, I came to realize that there are other kinds of important history, possibly even more important than the history I taught. So what makes history important? We need criteria, and I think usefulness is the proper one. What kind of history is most useful for helping people and society to function effectively? Surely this is the most important history for us to know. The dictionary defines useful as capable of being put to use. That is, we acquire knowledge at some point that can be applied at a later time. It can be put to use in the future. But history deals in knowledge of the past. How can historical knowledge be put to use in the future? I'd like to submit for your consideration 3 categories of history which provide knowledge that can be put to use in the future to inform judgment in human affairs. And I'll ask you to decide which is most important. Category A, history for understanding specific present-day issues when the need arises. Category B, the history of human development through time, the kind of history I taught in school. And Category C, recurring dynamics of history that reveal continuing tendencies in human behavior and in human events. While each of these categories of history has a different function to perform, all 3 can be useful for informing judgment in human affairs, which I and lots of smart people before me believe to be the primary purpose for historical learning. People like Thucydides, Machiavelli, David Hume, Thomas Jefferson, and Diane Ravitch, to name a few. Categories B and C, human development over time and recurring dynamics of history, can probably be learned most effectively in a structured learning situation like in school or college. While the first category, history for understanding present-day issues, is an unstructured and dispersed affair, most likely to be practiced outside of formal education. And it may be the easiest of the 3 to describe, so I'll begin there. When we want historical knowledge to help us understand a present-day concern, we're likely to turn to sources such as books, archives, primary sources, professional journals, periodicals, or news accounts. In other words, to historical records of one kind or another to obtain this information. Say you're an epidemiologist who wants to understand why certain minority groups might be distrustful of the medical care system and reluctant to obtain COVID vaccinations. For useful insights into this situation, you might examine historical accounts of the Canadian nutrition experiments conducted on First Nations children in the 1940s and 50s that included deliberate malnourishment. or the U.S. Public Health Service's Tuskegee syphilis study from the 1930s to the 1970s that denied needed medical treatment to black men. Native Americans and black people have historical reasons to be mistrustful of the healthcare system. Well, let's say you're a young soldier being sent off to a foreign war, and you want to understand why. When I was that young soldier with only a high school education that never mentioned Vietnam, I got my hands on 3 history books, which informed me that the Vietnamese people had been resisting foreign invaders for 1,000 years. Who knew? We didn't hear that on the news. I know because I was a newscaster. Reading these histories led me to conclude that the American invasion of Vietnam was no more likely to succeed than previous attempts, and as it turned out, history proved me right. For me, in that time and place, there could have been no more important history than this history, but I didn't learn about it in school, and it's unlikely that I could have. Without a crystal ball to see into the future, history teachers can't possibly know what specific events will befall their students in the future. The only practical means to acquire historical knowledge about such specific events is to consult historical records when the events occur. But there is something important here that we can learn in school, that we have the opportunity throughout our lives to access historical accounts that can supply indispensable, ignorance-busting background knowledge about the important matters that we will face as individuals and as a society, no matter what they are, and no matter how far in the future. We talk about historical thinking skills, which are distinct from historical knowledge. For my money, there can be no more important historical thinking skill than the awareness that we can consult historical accounts to enlighten us about important issues of the day when needed. It would be an excellent idea to give students in school some practice in using historical records to help them understand concerns presently faced by our society, so that they might become accustomed to seeking this kind of information about difficult issues they may face in the future. Such exercises could be productively paired with the thinking skill most often associated with history education, source analysis, which examines sources of information for credibility. Stanford University's Reading Like a Historian curriculum offers several criteria for evaluating sources, including the author's perspective and self-interest, the context of the times, and the existence of any corroborating viewpoints. So, what do you think about using historical records to understand present-day concerns? Could this be the most important history? Maybe so, but let us not jump to conclusions. We have 2 more candidates to consider. And unlike the historical knowledge we've just been discussing, knowledge about a specific issue obtained from external sources when needed, we're now going to look at a very different kind of animal, school-based learning that provides general knowledge that we carry inside our heads all the time. While the external knowledge available from historical records is extensive, nearly limitless, and the internal knowledge we carry in our heads is limited by the brain's capacity to learn and remember information. This internal knowledge is extremely important to our thinking because it forms our entire mental landscape, our conception of the world around us. Internal knowledge is the lens through which we perceive all new experience, and it's the armature to which all subsequent learning will be attached. Internal knowledge forms our attitudes, judgments, and decision-making every day, all day long. Internal knowledge is another name for knowledge held in long-term memory, which is another name for learning itself. Seems pretty important, wouldn't you agree? So now we're going to look at 2 kinds of school-based history, meant to provide knowledge carried in our heads, and consider which is more important, starting with history that describes human development over time, the kind of history I and others have taught in school. Major events in the story of the human experience. This may be the kind of history that most people would think of first when considering what constitutes the most important history. So what are the most important events in the development of our species? We would surely have to begin with the formation of the universe and our home planet Earth. which provided the conditions for life, including human life. Another major event, the invention of tools that helped our early ancestors to survive in a challenging environment, the beginning of the technological advancements that would shape so much of human life and activity today. There was spoken language that gave humans the ability to transmit knowledge between people and across generations, making it possible for humans to organize, cooperate, and plan for the future. Humans migrated from their place of origin in Africa, we think, eventually becoming the most widespread animal species in the world. When the Earth warmed, following the last ice age, only about 12,000 years ago, humans developed agriculture, and people no longer had to follow the wandering animal herds to make a living. They could settle in one place, grow crops, and build villages, towns, and cities. About 5,500 years ago, with the invention of writing, humans developed the complex societies that we call civilization, with their governments, religions, armies, formal education, and even historians. Another notable milepost on the human journey, the groundbreaking idea that maybe humans could govern themselves. They didn't need kings to tell them what to do. This was the invention of democracy in ancient Greece about 2,500 years ago. Then about 500 years ago, the great voyages of discovery connected human populations across the globe, changing the diets of people around the world and leading to the decimation of native populations in the Americas and elsewhere. Sparked by new discoveries in science, Enlightenment thinking took hold in the Western world, promoting the ideas of freedom, equality, and more democratic forms of government, leading to revolutions in the United States, France, Mexico, and South America. Beginning in the late 1700s, people learned how to make machines move by burning fuels, triggering the Industrial Revolution. It changed where people lived, how they lived, and how they moved through the world, eventually producing menaces we face today, including nuclear weapons and global warming. In the 1800s, the industrial nations used their powerful new machines of war to conquer and control peoples across the world, creating a pervasive colonial imperialism that produced generations of ethnic conflicts that still bedevil the world today. The space age began in 1957 when humans launched satellites into Earth orbit, a journey that revealed to us a precious blue jewel floating in space, a water-covered world teeming with life wholly unlike anything else we could see in all the black, lonely vastness of space. Additional notable events could be added to our list of historical developments that shaped the human species: the invention of the printing press, the Atlantic slave trade, the development of vaccines against dread diseases, 2 world wars fought in the first half of the 20th century, digital technology. Perhaps you could come up with others. Few people, I suspect, would argue that students in school should not learn about these major developments in the story of the human species. Yet in our present educational environment, this story of humanity can easily be lost amid the kind of mind-numbing detail found in overstuffed textbooks, voluminous history content standards, and favored in at least one prominent profit-driven program of history instruction. The story of human development over time can just as easily be lost amid the kind of piecemeal approaches to historical learning found in classrooms where teachers have abandoned any attempt to tell a coherent story of the human or the American experience, in favor of a random collection of probably photocopied lesson plans that may be said to encourage student thinking, when any school activity, no matter how peripheral or frivolous, may be justified on the grounds that it involves some kind of thinking. Thus, the story of humanity may be lost behind a dense wall of mind-numbing detail or through a random smattering of historical topics. A few moments ago, I summarized the story of human development in under 3.5 minutes. It took 468 words. If students were to leave school remembering the events represented by just those 468 words, they would likely have a better grasp of history than do most students now graduating from our schools and colleges. The story of America's development over time could likewise be summarized to make it comprehensible and memorable. But one brief telling of this story isn't enough to embed it in a person's long-term memory. The story needs to be made meaningful with salient examples from history, and it needs to be reinforced over time. Cognitive science has made it crystal clear that superficial coverage of large quantities of facts is essentially pointless. Getting knowledge into our heads and keeping it there requires deep learning of a limited number of important principles and concepts. Here's the magic formula identified by cognitive science. Important principles and concepts learned in multiple contexts over an extended period of time. Easy to say, much harder to do. Nonetheless, this is how students learn to read, write, and do their sums in elementary school, knowledge that they will successfully carry in their heads throughout their entire lives. Should a student or adult need more detailed information about a given historical topic than is available from memory, it's available at one's fingertips from an iPhone or a personal computer. Returning to our usefulness criterion, how can this kind of history, the story of human experience, be useful? I believe it can be useful in at least three significant ways. It can supply that once prized sense of history or historical perspective that only comes with a coherent overview of human development through time, knowledge that can contribute to society's collective judgment and our personal judgment by allowing us to place present concerns within the context of extended human experience. At a time when information is readily available at our fingertips, there is little need to memorize large quantities of facts. But in this age of information overload, we need now more than ever before a conceptual framework in our heads that can help us understand the information we find, a framework such as a coherent overview of history. As University of Chicago economist Stephen Levitt put it, it used to be that data was the scarce resource, but now it's the talent to understand the data that is a really scarce resource. And there can be no doubt that a knowledge of human development over time can help to satisfy that deep human psychological need to understand our own identity, to know who we are and where we came from. So, this knowledge of the major developments in the human experience, is this the most important history? Perhaps so, but we have one more category to consider. Recurring dynamics of history are historical patterns that have occurred repeatedly over a span of years, often over millennia. If a pattern has repeated multiple times in the past, there's a pretty good chance it will come around to visit us again. Recurring dynamics of history can identify more than similar events that have repeated through time, such as wars or financial crises. They can also reveal ongoing tendencies in human behavior that can result in undesirable events down the road, such as the human propensity to fear and attack people from groups different than our own. Recurring dynamics of history are valuable for informing judgment in human affairs by pointing out what to watch out for, to help guard society against unwittingly falling into waiting traps, as societies have done repeatedly in the past. Here are a dozen examples of important recurring dynamics of history. Epidemic diseases have repeatedly claimed countless lives and altered human societies. Democracy is fragile. It has repeatedly fallen to authoritarian rulers. Humans exhibit an instinct to exercise control over others, and humans exhibit a countervailing instinct to resist external control. Humans exhibit a propensity to fear, dislike, kill, subjugate, and discriminate against people from groups different than their own. People tend to promote their self-interest and the interest of their group, so bias is all around us. Political leaders often try to get their way by appealing to the emotions of their followers. Government actions tend to produce unintended consequences. Economies tend to be unstable and can malfunction if proper balance isn't maintained. Many or most military invasions of distant lands have failed over the long term. Powerful nations tend to prey on weaker nations. Rising powers, such as China, have a tendency to go to war against established powers, such as the United States. And even superpowers experience limits to their power. There is no guarantee that a pattern from the past will produce a similar result in the future, but past experience is usually the best indicator of future outcomes. We see this in our daily lives, where we routinely learn from experience by repeating actions that were successful in the past and by avoiding actions that turned out to be mistakes. Why on earth wouldn't we want to be just as smart with respect to historical experience? With respect to events that have the potential to involve large-scale death, destruction, and hardship? When they are pointed out, the recurring dynamics of history I listed moments ago may strike you as valid, perhaps even obvious, but they may go entirely unnoticed by the general public and by our nation's leaders unless they are pointed out. Pointing them out should be a primary function of history education. And so, after reviewing our three candidates for the designation of most important history, which one comes out on top? You, of course, will make your own determination. As for me, I'm going to hedge my bets and propose that we need all three kinds of history to understand our place in the world and the range of human possibilities for doing both good and ill. An ideal school history curriculum would, in my view, embrace all three categories of history by embedding recurring dynamics of history within a concise overview of human development through time. And it would teach students the valuable historical thinking skill of accessing historical records to illuminate present-day concerns when the need arises. If I were pressed to identify the most important history to learn in school, I would probably have to come down on the side of recurring dynamics of history, which offer concrete, practical knowledge of ongoing tendencies in human behavior that have repeatedly showed up to bite us, have repeatedly resulted in unfortunate outcomes. With awareness of these tendencies comes the opportunity to choose different and wiser paths in the future. This kind of knowledge, if taught in our schools, would finally provide a response to our culture's most persistent lament about historical learning or the lack thereof. Santayana's familiar warning, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I hope this video has provided you with some food for thought. If so, you might want to check out our other videos at futurefocusedhistory.blog or at the Future Focused History YouTube channel. I hope to see you again in the future.